Jon Phillips. Who on earth is GIIA, I hear you say? Well, GIIA is the Global Infrastructure Investor Association. We're a membership body with 100 or so members, and my members are sort of amongst the leading and largest investors in infrastructure around the world. Just to put you into context, they have about 3,000 assets across 70 countries. That's about $1.7 trillion of assets under management. So they're invested in a whole range of infrastructure, transport, energy, utilities, digital, social, you name it. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the funder perspective on net zero. And I'm even more delighted that I have a panel of experts that know a lot more about funding infrastructure than I do. So I am going to ask them to introduce themselves. And there's a 30-second elevator pitch from each of them before we get into the conversation. So bear with us. Geraint, off you go.
John, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the UK Major Ports Group, and we represent 40 of the major ports across the UK. And as you can imagine, the energy transition, the transition to net zero, ports are at the centre of that, really. And the larger ports in the UK, both legacy ports, both newer ports that have been built and operating in the last 10 years, will be at the centre of whatever comes next in terms of those opportunities. And we're really keen to drive government in partnership with the private sector and the ports to making sure we can deliver on the ambition that's come along with net zero, but making sure the ports are at the centre of all these great opportunities that come forward. John.
Very good.
So I'm from Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners. Quinbrook invests in the infrastructure needed to deliver the energy transition. We're focused on the UK, the US and Australia, and part of the portfolio we've been building is the US's largest solar and storage project, which is producing enough electricity to power the city of Nevada, the residential demand. We're building the UK's largest solar project in Kent, and we've also established the largest portfolio of synchronous condensers, which are key enablers of the energy transition as long duration support for inertia.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's James Emmett. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the UK Infrastructure Bank. The UK Infrastructure Bank is just under 3 years old, an arm's-length body, so we're 100% owned by government, but operationally independent. We invest in the United Kingdom across debt, equity, and sovereign guarantees. Very importantly for the taxpayer, we want the money back, and we put it into infrastructure at a wholesale level, so that's roughly above £25 million. Our focus is making sure that we deliver on the net zero transition and regional and local economic growth, but we don't compete with the private sector. Our job is to ignite, to bring together public and private, and to make sure that funding is available for that transition economy. And we'll talk more about that through the panel.
Great to see everyone. My name is Rob Pardy. I work for an infrastructure fund called I² Capital. The investors into those funds are doctors, nurses, teachers, so we take our responsibilities very seriously. We've deployed about $7 billion of capital into the energy transition to date. We invest across all the big renewable technologies, as well as things like batteries and grid stability projects as well. We're a global infrastructure investor, so we invest across Europe, North America, Latin America, India, Southeast Asia, and Australia. And what that means, and relevant to the conversation today, is that we're always comparing and contrasting markets as to where we want to invest, and we look at our investments on a risk-adjusted basis.
Ingrid, Edmund. I work for Columbia Threadneedle, where we have set up the European Sustainable Infrastructure Fund. We started investing about 4 years ago, so coinciding pretty much. Our first investment was in March 2020, at the same time as the pandemic started, so it was definitely an interesting time. We take the view on sustainability as being a broader sort of looking at energy transition, but also just transition. So we have a diversified portfolio. We've invested in transportation, digital, and directly delivering sort of energy, green energy in renewables. We invest at the lower end of the scale, so unlike my colleague here, we look at companies that need maybe sort of anywhere starting from 20, 30 million pounds, euros. It's European strategy, so we always compare as well UK versus other European jurisdictions where we see opportunities.
Okay, thanks panel, well done. First task accomplished. So just to recap, so you've got somebody who represents assets of ports in this context. You've got somebody who's a bank and is looking to contribute from taxpayers' funds to invest, and you've got three different investors in infrastructure, international investors in infrastructure that have got any number of markets in which to choose to deploy their capital. But we're here to, primarily at least, to have a look at the UK's opportunities in net zero, not exclusively, but let's start there. So I'm going to ask James to kick us off in a minute, and I want James to sort of try and explain to you when we talk about net zero investment opportunities in a UK context, what do you mean? Bring that to life, James. What is actually happening on the ground?
Absolutely. Look, John, thank you. I mean, the first thing to note is there are really significant opportunities in the United Kingdom. Unsurprisingly, as an arm's length body of government, we will only invest in the UK, so our money must go into the UK. But those opportunities and what we get excited about are the jobs, the ability to leverage private investments. We're just talking about public-private capabilities as we walked in here. Carbon capture technology, hydrogen in the industrial heartlands, replacing jobs, bringing together ports and how we think about ports for the supply chains and making sure that we have the right structures in place, gigafactories, mining in the southwest, to name a few. So we know that there are significant opportunities. I don't think that will surprise the audience. We've heard today, for those who've been listening to the stage presentations, quantums of circa 50 to 60 billion pounds per annum. And that comes from an OBR, an Office of Budget Responsibility report, which said by 2050 we need 1.4 trillion of financing. So look, that sounds a great opportunity if you're thinking about finance, right? But what's really important, if you break that down to about 50 billion, the private sector can probably do, without any prompting, 35 to 40 billion of that. Wow. Big gap, 10 billion. So we will invest circa 2.5 billion across debt, equity and sovereign guarantees and crowd in probably in the region of 3 to 4 times. That's what we're aiming for, right? So if you look at what we've invested to date, just over 3 billion, our crowding in, our bringing in of private capital, 10 billion. So the ability to bridge that gap is really important on the finance side, and I think we'll talk a bit more about the risk side in a minute. A few more points which are really worth emphasizing when we think about the UK environment. We want private capital, so as an arm's length body of government, we're not going to compete. This is really important. We will not compete with the private sector. We will partner, but we'll also stand back. In fact, in one of our deals, we cornerstoned a 150 million quid ticket. I come from the private sector. I used to run HSBC Europe, right? If you then were ratcheting down in the private sector, your bankers would be tearing their hair out, gnashing of teeth. We ratcheted down to 45 because private sector could take the rest. So we're really, really excited about the opportunities, but the opportunities really to crowd in by marrying private and public sector money together. We problem solve, we want to work together with the partners to figure out the right structures, and we're ready to do so, and that's really important. But it's also really important, and again, something we're discussing backstage, that private market expectations work with the public sector, but we bridge those expectations for risk, to manage the risk gap, and indeed the risk-reward equation, and I suspect we'll touch on that as we move forward.
Thank you, James. So, Geraint, let's take a dive into the world of ports a bit more and bring to life what net zero means in your context.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. It's an absolutely fascinating period over the next 5, 10, 15 years for the major ports across the UK. And in some ways, it's not just a challenge for the largely private sector owners of the ports, but for government as well, and a new government. Actually, this is interesting because I would go further than that and say there's a tyranny of choice here when it comes to net zero. There are so many potential schemes, so many developers that could potentially, and will all require port space, port activity, port investments. But I think there's a real challenge and opportunity for a new government coming in, and the opposition have come forward with plans to spend £1.8 billion of public money upon arrival into government. But that private money and public money needs to come together. But we do need to start getting down at this point. Is my ports are trying to invest over 10, 15, 20 years, and we do now start to have to getting down to what are the actual projects. Are they commercial? Are they technologically deliverable? Are they practical? Because if you think about the history of ports, I won't give you a long history lesson of the ports in the UK, but for hundreds of years, they have delivered on transitions for hundreds of years, and they will continue to do so. But what they can't do is potentially support every single project. We've got to get down to business now and start finding the sorts of projects we can actually back with public money and with private money.
Thank you. Robert, let's bring you in.
So we love the UK from an investment perspective, and if you just take a step back, the UK, we're an island. We have the second largest offshore wind market in the world. We have an aging nuclear fleet, and we have legislated coal closures. So that poses a lot of challenges because you have a lot of intermittent renewables on the system, and you're a retiring dispatchable generation. So from a investment perspective, there's a huge amount that needs to be done. And if you think about it, within the energy transition landscape, you have the upstream, which is the generation of the renewable power. You then how you transmit and distribute it. And so there's lots of opportunities in terms of network upgrades, but actually maintaining the safety and security of the electrical system. And so we're investing into large synchronous condenser grid stability type projects. And then you have how that power is actually consumed, so actually the electrification side of things. So we see a lot of opportunity there. And then when you couple that with demand, so demand is increasing substantially, and it's not distributed demand. You have things like data centers now, hyperscalers. Yeah. We had Amazon Web Services speak to us recently, and they're effectively saying that they're building 1 gigawatt data centers. So that is a power demand equal to the size of the city of Liverpool as a single point of demand. So there's huge opportunity there. And of course, the other thing that's really exciting about this, it's not just about net zero. Renewable power is cheaper than fossil fuel power. So every single corporate is looking to procure renewable power, low cost power, and they want stability. And we'll talk about winter of 2022. We had very volatile power prices, highest we've ever had, and that's a lot of the dependency that we have on interconnection. The French nuclear fleet was out. So there's a lot of policy response there, which is supporting domestic security of supply. So a lot of opportunities for us in the UK. We're really excited about it.
Thanks, Robert. Ingrid?
We also see a lot of opportunities in the UK, and in particular, we look at the transition, but also one of the most difficult to decarbonize sectors is transportation. So there is actually a lot there, to Geraint's point as well. On the port side, we are invested in a ferry company. Some of the conditions that you have, sailing conditions around the UK are not the friendliest ones. So you don't necessarily have green technology to sort of. It's not like the Nordics where they island hop, for example, so they can put small battery vessels and ferries to go around. So we see an opportunity there in sort of investing to decarbonize some of these sectors, and at the same time sort of getting pretty decent returns commensurate with the risk profile as well. We also obviously look at the generation side, flexibility projects. I think one of the difficulties that we see at the moment is that you have the risk reward spectrum, and some of the capital that has been raised, for example, from the UK pension funds, from the UK investors, is somewhat more risk averse than what we see now in the infrastructure paradigm. So infrastructure has kind of moved a little bit from sort of very predictable, very stable returns in some ways, to having to deal with more volatility in the markets and new technologies. And some of the investors who are currently there are not necessarily the ones who can take that risk in that particular form. So I think it's a continuous sort of education at the same time of our investors to be able to take advantage of some of these opportunities that we see, and having the right capital to invest in those, having the right partnerships. What we see a lot is partnering actually with strategics, so where you have sort of newer technologies or newer products, is looking where is the demand coming from. And some of that demand, if you look at sort of batteries, for example, you have industrial who are desperate to get involved in those, or e-fuels, or that sort of thing, the whole supply chain. So I think there is so much opportunity there. So I think it's just a matter of finding the right way of partnering, finding the right capital to partner together a bit, where the UKIB can play definitely a role, and some of the other investors and debt providers into the market.
Rosalind?
So I was reflecting on the various ministers' statements about the UK being one of the first to get to 50% of decarbonisation. And it is a major achievement, and the primary mover on that has been decarbonisation of power. And it's sort of the low-hanging fruit of how we're going to achieve net zero in the UK. And when we're looking at that opportunity, we're thinking from a holistic perspective across generation, across storage, to manage that response to that challenge that you're intermittent, and across grid support. Those have been the key areas that we've been looking to do that, because the UK is rare in offering long-term inflation-linked revenues for the investment in the infrastructure that is required to deliver the net zero transition, to stably decarbonise the grid. And when we are looking at our projects such as synchronous condensers, a lot of people in the market won't have heard of them. And I have to congratulate I². They beat us by about 10 days to closing the financing on them. They closed their Pathfinder 3 about 10 days before we did Pathfinder 1 and 2. But these are projects which are century-old technology that are given a new challenge, a new need, because we're decarbonising the grid with asynchronous technology. We need to put the spin back in the grid to maintain our alternating current. That's one of the multi-part elements we need to decarbonise. We need to have new generation. Now, the UK, one of our operating nuclear plants is going to be operating post-2030. That's Sizewell B. Every other standing plant is being retired for age. Hinkley is at best going to come online in 2029. That is 16 years from its planning consent. On that basis, Sizewell C is going to be online post-2036. Now, we're not just retiring coal because of policy and nuclear because of age. Over a third of our operating combined cycle gas turbines are being retired for age before 2030. And that's why you'll have seen policy statements saying we need 3 new CCGTs. That's because we are retiring so much at the same time as we're electrifying transport and heating. So we're increasing demand at the point where we're reducing supply. And if we have another strong period of heat, like we did in 2022, the run-of-river French reactors had to close. They couldn't safely cool their nuclear reactors in the summer of 2022. It wasn't just scheduled maintenance or unscheduled maintenance that put these nuclear reactors offline. So we're looking to build new generation capacity. And we have strong offshore targets, which are great. We have strong solar targets. Currently, there are rumours in the market that these solar targets are going to get weakened. But when you have strong sustained policy, you have ability to really galvanise the change in building new generating capacity, and you have these long-term inflation-linked revenues via the CFD or a corporate power purchase agreement that support that investment case.
Thanks, Rosalind. So, I guess it's self-evident, but just in case it isn't, the UK is in a competitive situation in terms of its relative attractiveness for investment. These international funds can select any country that is providing the right combination of investment characteristics that they're looking for. You may have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act that the US has brought forward. Huge, tax-funded incentive program, the likes of which has never been seen before, catapulted the US from being an also-ran market to top of the league for investor sentiment at the moment. The European Union has tried to sort of come up with comparable schemes. So the UK's attractiveness does not sort of sit entirely alone in terms of, it's not entirely in the gift of the government to shape it, but it is necessarily a challenge that I think the government is going to need to address going forward. So I'm going to magic us to a place where we're just beyond, on day one of the new government post the next election, choosing my words very carefully about who that might be. But if we've got an opportunity to land messages with the policymakers that are going to need to shape the investment environment for the next 5, 10, 15 years, I'm going to ask my panel for their thoughts and their wisdom on the things that they would like to see more of, or the things that I'd like to see less of, that might just do the kind of necessary unlocking of that international or domestic capital. So I'm going to kick off again with you, Rosalind. You waited patiently for your contribution, so you kick off the round two.
I would like absolute certainty that we will maintain our cross-party support for renewables and decarbonisation of power. Let us start with the fact that about 40% of the world goes to vote this year. In many countries, you do not have cross-party support, and what the investment community likes is long-term certainty. Now, the nuance at the moment is that Labour would like 100% low-carbon power by 2030, and the Conservatives 95% low-carbon power by 2030. Now, as far as politics goes, that is consistent support, great. Now, I would like to really emphasise a key misrepresentation about renewables. Renewables, onshore wind, offshore wind, onshore wind and storage, solar and storage, are at the point they are cheaper in terms of the lowest cost of energy than combined cycle gas turbines. They are far cheaper than nuclear. So if we are talking about affordability of power going forward, we need to replace the retiring capacity that is being retired because of age, not because of policy, because of age, with what is cheapest to generate, and that is renewables. And to give you a big number to think on, we're all used to seeing a levy on our bills at home for the cost of renewables. However, in the 18 months from Q4 2021 to Q1 2023, renewables paid back £0.7 billion into the central reserves. And that's wind and solar projects that had CFDs. So it is not more expensive to build renewable.
Thanks, Rosalind. Geraint.
It's absolutely fascinating to hear many of the comments made today. But I think for a new government, there's lots of assumptions being made by the current administration at official level across government around the future energy scenarios. And I think one of the first things that a new government could do is sort of reassess those assumptions, because I think there is a challenge around the ability to get the power we need, where we need it in good time as we think about the investability of various projects. The other bit I would think is important is to think about the fundamentals of what allows investment. My ports invest somewhere north of £600 million a year between them, just maintenance, renewals, further investment into individual ports. But what we need is a planning system that works. We need to abolish the regulatory drag. We need to have the power we need when we need it. We need to have a genuinely strategic case of modal shift, how we think about rail, road and water in terms of in and around our ports. And I think the other bit for a new government, of course, is to define what we mean by long term, because for my ports, they're often investing over 10, and for institutional investors, investing for long-term stable investments over 10, 20, 30 years. And I used to work in government, and often a long-term policy was 3 years. Now, there is a big disconnect there, and that's not a criticism or anything, but then a new government can potentially push these two things together. And the other thing I would like to think that we can do is to don't allow perfection to be the enemy of the good here, because there's some fantastic projects that could happen in this country. The political ambition is to have the perfect solution with the perfect number of jobs, with the perfect part of the United Kingdom. It's a bit messy than that, and I think that we've got to think about the actual projects, and I go back to my point about the tyranny of choice. For any new administration, they've got to sort of think, okay, what's the funnel here to real projects? And if it means we don't get all the jobs right away, or we don't get the perfect outcome right away, I think we need to accept that, but let's get on with things in this country. Because, as Jon highlighted, certainly for ports, we're competing with northern France for many really interesting projects. On Teesside, we're competing with Norway and the Nordics. So it is genuinely a global race, and I slightly worry when I hear how much knowledge there is about some of the ports in France and the Nordics, when I want them to be thinking about our ports. Jon.
Well done, Geraint. Okay, Robert.
So I think before we look forward, it's helpful to look back. And actually, if you look over the last 3 to 4 years, we've gone from a health crisis with COVID to a supply chain crisis. We had an energy crisis, extreme volatility over the winter of 2022. And actually now we're in a situation where power demand is actually 10% off historical levels, right? So there's actually been a lot of industrial curtailment has gone on at the moment. I think going forwards, what's going to be really important is predictability and certainty to attract capital. And we're a global infrastructure investor, so the point that you make that capital is very mobile, right? We're constantly assessing which geographies do I want to be in, not just in a UK and a Europe perspective, but actually including Asia, Australia, North America, as you say, with the IRA. If we take it to the UK and Europe perspective, there has been a very strong response to the energy crisis across all of Europe, and that has been expedited permitting of renewable projects in particular. It's been the underlying economics for those projects, so actually improving returns for investors, and then it's been access to the grid, which has been a challenge. And so I think what the UK needs to do is look at the competing geographies that capital is going into and make sure that the regime is sufficiently attractive, because to Rosalind's point, renewables are cheap, right? We all want more renewables, we just need predictability over that. So long-term feed-in tariffs or contracts for different type mechanisms, they provide that certainty, and it actually then supports the financing both on the equity and the debt side of things. So it brings down the cost to consumers as a whole, and once you have predictability and certainty, you can then attract industry, right? You take Germany as an example at the moment. Germany's just coming out of recession at the moment, but its industry has been very, very significantly curtailed because of the exposure that it had to Russian pipeline gas. So we want to avoid that in the UK. Energy is absolutely critical for industry to prosper, and that's where the government really needs to step in.
Ingrid.
I totally echo all the sort of comments so far, and I think from our perspective as well as the collaboration between the different government departments and policymakers. I think there needs to be sort of more coherence, and also it is important that if a new government comes into play, things don't slow down. So to keep the momentum on facilitating the transition to net zero, facilitating the different parts of that transition which come from the industrial side, energy, decarbonization, transportation, all the different sectors. And finally, bring along also the financial sector, because sometimes there is a disconnect between the financial regulators. So, look at the pension funds, insurance companies, you have the solvency, you have the Mansion House Act and so on. But, this bringing together both the industrial side and the financial side would help bridge that financing gap that we all talk about. I mean, we need billions and billions and billions, and they're not all going to come from the public sector, and they're not all going to come from the private sector. So strengthening that and sort of removing a little bit of the stigma of private-public partnerships, which obviously has different manifestations. It's sort of, they need to really encourage that coming together to facilitate ultimately the transition and the investment landscape.
I think that's a great point. We might just have time to come back on that. So thanks, Ingrid. James.
Well, let me try and come back on that immediately. I mean, absolutely, we've got to remove stigma around private public partnerships. In fact, one of our key roles as the UK Infrastructure Bank is to do that. We are here to partner with the private sector to bridge that financing gap to make sure that we can finance 50 billion plus per annum. I'd like to, I think, pick up on a few points, and it's interesting, it's rare you come at the tail end and you can wrap up on consistency. The first is this message: the UK remains a really good place to invest. And this is consistent. Rosalind emphasized this sort of consistency of policy. Net zero consistency in policy is really important, but I think we have that, whatever hue of government we're talking about moving forward. We do need to encourage more project sponsors in this country. So we want more projects to be initiated, to be taken forward. We've got a lot of folk looking at financing and supporting. Actually, I'll go almost as far as to say, certainly at the wholesale level, financing is not the major issue in this area. We need projects to get the detail behind it, actually, Geraint, I think we talked about earlier. And that's really important. But a clear message from all of the investors, and I played a bit of bingo as we went through here, is certainty, continuity, consistency. I didn't have predictability, but I did have clarity. So I reckon that's not too bad. 3 out of 4, if you like, in those, or out of 5. And those are very consistent messages, and we as an arm's length body of government are working with government to help shape that, and certainly those are really important messages. Ultimately, our role is to maximize the opportunities that arise from net zero that we talked about up front, for jobs, for investments, for making sure that we can deliver the infrastructure, but very importantly, to make sure that we can deliver on this lowest cost of renewable energy across the board, and make sure that we take that forward. And frankly, this really good point of competing with the very rapidly moving markets out there. But that's what, certainly from a UK infrastructure bank, we have a key role to play in that. John.
Thanks, James. Just to say, we've got 8 minutes left on our slot. So if anybody does have a question that they'd like to pose, then we're happy to pick up one or two. So it'll take a few moments for the microphone to get to you. In the meantime, Geraint?
I would simply add that if you think about where my personal interest over my now lengthy career has been regional economic development and what we now call levelling up. And again, a new government will call it something different, and but the fundamentals won't change about supporting communities, and particularly where, I don't have a map of my ports, but if you look at where my 40 ports are, some of them are in some pretty economically deprived areas and generational challenges. And I think there is a moment here, and there is a jeopardy here, is that as we move through this process of iterating the various projects and the various schemes and the projects that can come forward as part of the energy transition, how we deliver these is pretty fundamental. Because if I point to a couple of examples, the steelworks in Port Talbot, for example, been there for 70, 80 years. That will be gone in 2 or 3 years' time or 5 years' time. What could replace that is thousands of highly paid, highly skilled jobs in floating offshore wind. But could is the most important word here. We've got to get that right. Up in Teesside, there's a huge amount of work that's been done to transition to new fuels and new fuel production and storage up there. But again, there's a moment of jeopardy here, because we do have to make sure that the private money and the public money is aligned, and I think only a new government can deliver that at this point in the process.
And I'm just going to pick up myself as well on the public-private partnership kind of component of that, and it's just to make this point. The 3 international investors that are here, and the people who own the ports that Geraint represents, where does their money come from? It comes from you, right? Your pension savings are invested in at least a proportion of your pension savings are invested in infrastructure. We've just done some research, and I can tell you that it's more than 10 million people in the UK have some of their investment invested in UK infrastructure through international investors such as these. So there is a win-win here, and my message to the government is they've got to make investing in infrastructure in the UK a more attractive proposition in order to drive even greater levels of investment. So that's my pitch. Now let's take a risk and see what this gentleman's going to throw at us.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. I asked the previous panel the same question, unfortunately, because I didn't think I'd be able to stay for this. So here I go again, and I'll be very quick. My name's Anton Kohl. I'm the founder of the Startup to Scale Up Club. So this question will be on startups. In 3 years, by the way, we've had over 250,000 people join us as we've
Let's
held...
make it a question, sir.
Indeed, sir.
Yeah.
I'll be very quick. What we've found from the thousands of founders that come to us is that investors either don't see a big enough market to invest in startups that work on Innovation Zero, or two, they see them as a bit of an impact venture or perhaps non-profit. And what we've found is that if governments opened up their supply chain, that would largen the market. So it's a two-part question. One, what could we do to encourage government to do that? And two, what could government do to encourage you to invest in such startups?
Okay, so this one's coming to James, because I think in terms of startup, that's a little early in the investment cycle for our investors. But so James, you take this one.
Yeah, John, look.
Who else? There's a gentleman over there, and there was a gentleman at the back. If you want to, there and there.
Look, it's a really important question. I mean, clearly most here are talking from a wholesale perspective, but we recognise the real importance. The British Business Bank is focused in that space and works closely with us to do that. I'm sure your members are working with them. But I think it's fair to say, whilst we're substantially more wholesale investors, that recognition of the importance of getting financing and allowing scale up, particularly for innovative ideas, but into that scale up Series A, Series B environment is really important, and one that we've still got to really crack.
Well done, James. So we have 3 minutes left. So a question, not a statement, please, sir.
My name is Simon Lloyd from Remax Investors. Have you thought about using blockchain of carbon assets to fund green energy projects?
And so before anybody starts answering that, can we just take the third question, and then you can take your pick as to which one you like.
Hi. Dan Travers. I was asking particularly about, do you believe there's a gap in the investment in digital assets? So I think one of the things that I see in the energy industry is there needs to be a lot more digital infrastructure around data and forecasting and information and situational awareness. Do you think there's a gap, and how do you value those assets? Okay,
so digital infra, I'm sure any one of my three investors would like to take digital. Does anybody want to have a go at blockchain? No?
Look, so in full disclosure, I'm the former CEO of the operating company for Libra. So blockchain is something that we've looked at extensively. Digital assets potentially play a really important role, but actually getting the infrastructure in place and a lot of the institutional DeFi, I think, is probably the key way of addressing that moving forward. I think more to come, but there's certainly a lot of interest in the institutional DeFi angle on that.
Robert, digital?
Yeah, so look, on the digital infrastructure side of things, there's a very complementary relationship. If you think about things like batteries, storage technology, a lot of the services that batteries are providing are instantaneous. So they're ancillary services that provide things like frequency response to the grid. It needs reactions that are quicker than what a human is able to offer. So in some of our portfolio companies, we have algorithmic type trading capabilities. So the two certainly go hand in hand.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're 1.5 minutes to close, so I don't think I'm going to open up another question. If you'd like to come up to the panel afterwards, then please do, right? Thank you. I hope you found that interesting, and thank you for your attendance and your questions.